Hi, my name is Michael Bartlett. I'm an astrologer here in Santa Fe, New Mexico.
And I'm Merrylin LeBlanc, and I'm an astrologer also here in Santa Fe, New Mexico. And Michael, this month, one of the things that has been on my mind a lot is women's suffrage. And so I'd like to talk about that today, more from the perspective of why haven't we been considered equal to men throughout history and time as we know it? That in fact women having equal rights to men is universally having those rights is a more contemporary or modern phenomenon. And what's behind that? And so in thinking about it, um, for me anyway, it led me to looking at the astrological ages. Um, some astrologers vary on this. Some will say that we have entered the age of Aquarius. Some will say we're just still in the end of the Piscean age. But in any event, when you look at the zodiac signs and these ages, which last approximately 2,000 years, 2,000 years one sign and then the transition to another sign. It's not even though, and actually if you were to look at these based on the zodiac signs as they're formed around the path of, behind the path of the sun, you can also see that the zodiac signs themselves vary in degrees, but in tropical astrology, we deal with them in terms of the Earth's latitude or parallel lines and give 30 degrees to each sign, but it's really symbolic. It's not literal. And so anyway, looking at the whole question of female male equality. I mean, we could take this back to the myth of Adam and Eve, and maybe we'll talk about that a little bit, but looking just at the zodiac signs, the age of Pisces is considered a feminine sign, okay? The water and earth signs are considered feminine, and the air and fire signs are considered masculine. So if we're still in the age of Pisces, it's a feminine sign. And when we look at, usually avatars introduce a sign, for the ages. And so Jesus, the Buddha, which, he came maybe about 500 years before Jesus. I'm not, I don't know about the exact numbers there, but I know that they weren't contemporaries in the true sense of the word. Muhammad came, about that many years, 500 or 600 years maybe after Jesus did. But these were the avatars that we saw at the beginning of the Piscean age. And Pisces is not only a feminine sign, it's a sign that represents in astrology the great mother, the feminine that gave birth to the universe, to all that is. It has that kind of no boundaries, everything is included, nothing is excluded. Nothing. I mean, even what we consider good, bad, and indifferent, all of it is included in the sign of Pisces.
Even the no thing.
Yeah.
Right?
And,
as an aspect of Pisces too, it's also the no thing.
Right. Exactly. And if we go to the signs before that, going back, going in zodiacal order as we astrologers look at it, we would go to air, and actually it's going backwards in a way. We go to Aries, and Aries being a fire sign, a masculine sign. And what we know of history in the Aryan age was really on a societal level, was really a dominance of men. I mean, the great societies in that period were the Greek society, and partly the Egyptian came into that, and um, the Roman Empire began with the beginning of the Piscean Age. Um, so men were fairly the warrior class, and during the Aryan Age, I want to make a point here. When we look at the Greek dominance of that age, for the most part, women were second-class citizens. They were treated well, though. I mean, like, I think there was a Greek saying that said, you know, have to have happiness, you have to have a happy home life, which meant you really had to have, you know, a wife who was happy, although women were expected to stay in the home and raise the kids and take care of the home, not get involved in the government business, et cetera. And there were some women philosophers, but very few, and not, you know, looked at kind of differently or whatever. In the city states, I know this from my personal growing up years, the Spartans were a little different in regard to women. The women couldn't vote, but they were encouraged to do everything else. They were considered strong women. They were engaged in wars. They were engaged in athletics and everything of that sort. And the high school I went to, the girls' high school I went to in San Francisco, we were called the Spartans. That wasn't the name of the school, but we were called Spartans because their intention was to make strong women out of us. And the Spartans thought that, you know, in order to have strong men, they were birthed from women, you had to have strong women. And so there was that kind of encouragement, and yet they weren't fully treated as equals. Okay, so there were remnants there. But the age before this Aryan Age, we go to the Minoan culture in Crete, for example, is an example of this age. That was Taurus. It's a feminine sign, the sign of the bull, and you see imagery in some of the artifacts from that period that depict even the bull. And the Cretan Minoan culture was considered a matriarchal society, and women were very strong. And there were another group of women too. There were the Amazons, who the Amazon women who featured in some of the Greek mythology, actually going back into the Aryan Age. And so the point I want to make, though, in looking at these ages, is, because I'll get to the Piscean Age in just a moment, is that when we had the Taurian Age with, you know, women being strong, there was some carryover of that into the Aryan Age. It isn't like, how does consciousness change? And this is something astrology doesn't really tell us. We learn this by what we learn from the people who lived during. We learn that from the history of that period, or if it's contemporary time and you and I are dealing with clients in astrology, we learn about their consciousness by our conversation with them. But without certain kinds of conversations, we don't really know exactly what they're taking in and what's going on in that mind of theirs. I mean, there are certain common things that we all have, but that's about where it ends, without further discussion or observation, for that matter. So looking at this, I'm going, and I got to this conclusion based on the Piscean Age and my perspective of it. But I'm going, okay, so some of the female-oriented culture of the Taurian Age was maintained into the Aryan Age, and by example, the Amazon women, the Spartan women, and probably other cultures which aren't dominant in our history. In the era in which I had received my schooling, that was where we focused. I mean, today there may be cultures in the Americas or Far Eastern cultures that might have given more dominance to women versus men during different periods. But as we enter the Piscean age with the birth of the avatars I mentioned at the beginning, Jesus, the Buddha, Jesus, and Mohammed as chief ones, this is the sign of the Great Mother, okay? And what I know, and you probably also from the teachings of Jesus, since we were raised in that culture, is that Jesus loved women. And I mean this in a universal, heartfelt sense. I mean, he may have loved them in other ways, but that's not the point of today's discussion at all. And he stood up for them. He stood up for the adulteress. He stood up for Mary listening to him instead of helping Martha in the kitchen. And in some of the Gospels, you hear him referring, to his mother in other regards. And the church, the Catholic Church, is referred to as the mother church, etc. And so in the early church with the Apostle Paul, you also saw how he treated and elevated women to key positions in the early church. And somewhere a few hundred years into the church's history, there was this kind of dominance that took over. And so my point here is that with the Pisces, I used to say, my earlier years ago perspective on this was that the Piscean age failed because it didn't really bring us a feminine dominated culture, okay? At least that's my perspective. And what I think happened is it's sort of like going back to how the Greeks, especially the Athenians, felt that you really had to keep women happy to have a happy home life. So, they weren't allowed to go out and vote and do the things that men were doing for the most part, but they were kept happy. So I'm thinking, that dominated throughout certain cultures in history. And I used to feel this way about women back in the 70s with women's, or late 60s with women's lib. I used to think that that actually women did actually really demonstrate also against the suffragettes that we've been celebrating this past month. And part of it is that they have been privileged to a lot of comforts without having the ultimate responsibility of getting those comforts. And this may be a subconscious guide in their minds. I'm not saying that women some do. I know some who do actually, but I'm not saying that women consciously kept men in a dominant position, but I'm saying that some may have, and definitely a lot unconsciously, because it provided a comfortable life. I mean, I could refer to family members, people that I'm related to, who have almost as much as said that about their relationships. And not that they said it in the way I'm saying it or in the context I'm saying it, but in fact, you could infer by that, well, they're willing to not be an equal voice in certain matters in order to maintain the comforts that they have. And fortunately, my mother was not that way. I have to give her credit for that.
Security versus freedom, right?
Yes, exactly.
Some people are willing to give up theirs, will give up a lot of their freedom. I mean, that's a lot of what we're also doing. And it's also a theme here too, right? How do we give up our security and stand up and have that freedom? I mean, the number of women, the women who were suffragettes who had to stand up, the ones who were picketing and doing things, they were spat upon. They had rocks thrown at them by everyone, by children, by other women. By, I mean, like you said, and it's like, that's got to be such a horrible feeling. It's like, I think anyone who's, any woman who's like has friends who's a woman in the Republican Party, you know, you've got to kind of have that kind of feeling too. It's like, oh, what are you doing right now? How can it's fighting against something that just isn't right. You know, these things need to change.
How can you support somebody who's a womanizer?
Right.
I mean, this is like, who doesn't respect women? And on the other hand, men can say the same thing to a woman. I mean, how can you respect a man who, or a man rather, a man, how can you respect a woman who doesn't respect you? So, I mean, the respect has to be equal on both sides, back and forth. And I give that to the Greeks, that they recognize that there is a certain balance there. But, you know, when it comes to economy, which is a Cancerian topic, you know, the women in Greece were given control of the home, and that's how economy started. How do you make sure there's food and shelter and stuff like that? Well, that was up to the women to take care of, but whoever takes care of it, you have to respect that, and also give that person a voice in that to maintain a certain level of compatibility and, more important, I think, happiness. So anyway, this whole thing of the ages has been a major factor for me in looking at this. And it was only towards the end of if the Piscean age has ended or even is about to end, it's only been towards this ending that this question of equality in voting comes up. And the point that I really need to make, that you brought up for me, and astrologically speaking too, is that when we're looking at voting from an astrological perspective, we're looking at two planets, the planet Uranus and the planet Neptune. Uranus being that freedom, and Neptune being that that belief system that goes into the vote. You know, we vote for the person we believe will be the better choice
For everyone.
You know, for everyone. And and it so happens that those two planets rule the ages that we're in transition from and to. Neptune ruling Pisces and Uranus ruling Aquarius. And some of us feel like we're already into the Aquarian age. Some say, oh, not quite yet, but we're definitely in that middle zone of transition. And so back, you know, coming back to the vote, when it wasn't just in this country. I mean, I remember watching films about, or documentaries about women's suffragettes in England or whatever. But a lot of this arose in the mid 1800s, no matter where in the world you were. And at that period of time, and I wrote this down somewhere. The Uranus Neptune came together in 1821 in the sign of Capricorn. And Capricorn is a feminine sign, and it's a sign that has to do with structure, okay? And so I feel like, you know, that energy, Neptune will dissolve what is no longer needed, and Uranus will help free up what needs to come forth, what needs to be birthed. You know, in the mythology about Uranus and his penis being castrated and his penis being thrown into the ocean, he didn't have to have children anymore to get the ideal child. The ideal child came from that penis that, you know, was thrown in the ocean, and out of that arose Aphrodite, the ideal child. Yes.
Well, I'm thinking that time period too. I mean, we're talking about Jane Austen, right? And this is right after the Age of Reason, and where there's kind of beginning to be an understanding that women are not property, that women are not. I mean, of course, we're not even talking about when it gets into racism and all the other things that are still rampantly going on, but it's almost like a little bit of a window gets opened up into the soul of womanhood for the first time in a long period. And there's an elevation on a higher societal level, and maybe like almost an awareness of a little bit of the sacred feminine again that I think kind of comes in at that time. I think that's that period where they have the high waist, that the empire dress. There's this, that the classical ideas are coming back in, this idea of like equality and right human relationship. These higher ideals come in, so it's like such a perfect time. Then here we go, fast forward to what, late 1880s to early 1890s, and then we have Uranus, Neptune conjunct again in Capricorn.
Right, right. Well, yeah, they were in 1990s. They were 93,
Yeah.
1993. Yes, yeah, again in Capricorn. But in terms of and actually, that's a good point in terms of the overall picture, because even though women have had the right to vote since 1920 in this country, Black women in the South didn't get to vote until the mid 60s, and with civil rights legislation, thanks to President Johnson. And yeah, and so there, that kind of, again, it's that kind of bleeding of energy, because just to go back to the ages for a minute, as we're going into the Aquarian age, it's a masculine sign, but it's an androgynous sign. It's not personal, and it's actually what we call the collective signs. It deals all over, and what we have seen is not only homosexuality becoming more accepted and recognized, and and just out there, but all forms of sexuality coming out.
Yeah.
And this is a very Aquarian, because so it's sort of like, no matter what, the human needs to be honored and recognized, and be able to develop the fullest potential that is within each human. Yes.
Well, it's funny because you talk about I mean I consider it personally that we are like in this transition period, and with these ages being such a large chunk of time, that of course it's going to take a little while for the transition. And I think actually, in order to step into the Aquarian age out of Pisces, there has to be this understanding and acceptance of this wide and deep range of human expression, right? It's not just June and Ward Cleaver, and the boys, it's everyone. It's the Brady Bunch. It's it's the family, from Good Times. It's different strokes. It's all these different things that we're learning to understand, not only just in our color, but in our religious experience, in our emotional, psychological experiences, in our societal cancerous, cancer type experiences within our families, our nationalities. Those of us who come here in the States, a lot of Europeans kind of laugh at us because a lot of us will say, well, like I'm Portuguese American or I'm Italian American. And those in the old country are going like, you're an American. Come on, get over yourself. But the truth is, we all want to belong to some sort of a group. And it's funny because you talked earlier about kind of like this, the benefit of having the right to have that right. And I think, what we're seeing now with this wide range of expression, Black Lives Matter, gender expression along the continuum, all of them matter. We're learning to like try and allow for, accept, and elevate all expressions along the continuum, as long as we're not harming one another, which just has to stop. I mean, gosh, another another Black man shot in the back for getting into his car. I mean, I don't even know how any of this can even make sense anymore, that anyone is even still doing any of this stuff anymore. I mean,
well, the only thing I can think of is they don't watch the news or listen to news,
or they're
because
here.
How could they be so out of what are some of the biggest issues facing us they're they have to be living in their own little bubble
Well, in a
to
sense,
not.
we talk about, this Piscean, Neptunian kind of experience. I think sometimes there are people, I think many people act in a way for the collective. We're talking these trans relational signs and planets. I mean, I think uh, sometimes we find ourselves saying and doing things, and after the fact we wonder, like, what the hell we do. On that level, God, I hope people have the ability to say no and stop themselves before they do that. There's just no reason to do it. But I think we're just having to see this over and over again to make something happen. I mean, look how many school children have been killed, and we still don't have any gun violence, any protection against guns. I'm really happy for seeing Black Lives Matter, but the thing is, we need to understand that every life matters. That women's lives matters. The amount of domestic violence that's going on now because of the COVID and the lockdown.
Well, how you're talking about people's consciousness. How do we change? How do people grow an awareness of consciousness? How do we change people's consciousness? This country is in the baby stages of accepting the whole practice of psychology.
Right.
And herein lies part of the problem, is that I think the vast majority, I mean, even though, there's people like you and me have been to therapists of all sorts, and recognizing that the rational mind is only one part of our psyche, only one part of our intelligence even. And if that has been, and this country, the culture of this country and of some of the politics that have gone on in this country have really shut that down. I mean, there's pockets of wonderful education on all levels, and even if it's just on the intellectual level, there's pockets of great. But what we're seeing today, we know that there are an overriding sometimes number of places where you could almost call them illiterate, even though they've been schooled. That's how I see it from my view. But the point is that, thinking of that saying, you can bring a horse to water, but you can't make him drink. And dealing with the psyche of human beings, people have to be willing to change. If they're not, and I'll tell you, it is one of the humbling experiences of my life. If you're not willing to change, and so we need, when I think about cultures like, the kind of culture that's in the Scandinavian countries and Denmark and Holland and whatnot. And I have to say something about the people there, that there is an openness to psychological development, a recognition. Yeah, I met people from those countries that aren't crazy about their high taxes. But when you start growing in spiritually as well, when you start growing beyond this image, and one of the things that was, this is a side, when you start growing beyond that, I want to say something else too. Then you start growing beyond that, you actually, it's more humbling, but it's also enriching. It's like you see the world with new eyes. You think at my age, you think you'd seen it all, but I'm going, no, I haven't yet. And of course, there's some things I don't want to see, but it's all right. One of the things I wanted to say was, in terms of the Piscean age and how the masculine seemed to dominate the Piscean age. And part of that, I think, goes back to the Christian culture. The early Christian church gave women an equal place in that world. But somewhere in the church councils along the way, before we even hit the first millennium, that they started, it was sort of like that pull towards we're we're the stronger sex and we need to be responsible for the women, and but then giving Jesus titles like my Lord. I mean, this kind of, somebody I know has, and somebody I've been talking to recently, and I can't quite, has used the term domination. That 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 has been used by organizations on very, from small to large, to keep people in their fold. And it's a kind of a, there's great things about masculinity, and I'm not talking about men necessarily, but it's an energetic that both men and women have. But in terms, and there's great things about being male. I'm not, I want an equal relationship, is what I'm trying to say. But when you start using language which influences the psyche very strongly, I mean, we have a person in the White House right now is very powerful in the way he does that with his base. But when you start using images like Lord, Master, the Father, it really sets in the psych. It's a controlling factor, and this is done by humans. This is not done by some entity that we call God, in my opinion. Purely my opinion.
Organizations and governments are, it's a way to work with the people. It's a way to, I think in a certain level, we're talking about belief structures, right? We're talking about, ways of structuring society. It starts in the home, of course, and then, thanks to the programming that we get from church and from school and from government and from our community and everything, that kind of helps shift us around. But in a way, it's funny because, Freud talks about penis envy, but I think the real root of it is womb envy. I think men's inability to create something like a woman can is a fun, in a sense, I don't know, is it a fundamental drive that pushes men towards creation, or is it just what it is that we do in our creative process, that since we can't create life in that way, we create buildings, we create sculptures, we create all these other things, in the sense of like, because I think being human is creative, but as long as one side is being negated, as long as is the feminine, which as you and I have talked about so many times, every single one of us on the planet so far who is alive is here because we came through a woman's body.
Yeah, well, that makes me think, I don't know for a fact who, and it could have been a woman who is operating off of her masculine energy, who conceived of test tube babies, and actually, in DNA studies, I mean, we've been able to create certain animals from the technology.
But
And
not a womb yet.
Huh?
No
What?
womb yet. You
Yeah,
still need
yeah.
you still need, and that's the sacred feminine. I mean, I think that's the real, and I think that's the part.
The test tube isn't a womb.
Well, it's another kind of womb, to be honest. I see it as an Aquarian womb, and I can't tell you how many, like in my book on astrological mavericks, how many of the first test tube and in vitro and all that are all mavericks who have planets on an angle in Aquarius. So there's, here we are, it's this building again on this theme. It's like taking humanity now and separating it from itself, because, Aquarius has that separating factor, right? It isn't the oneness that is attained in Pisces. It's not quite there yet. It's still assembling and organizing all the pieces and trying to figure it out and trying to recreate what actually happens in the Piscean thing of letting go and then actually creating life from that place.
Right. And that's the womb is a Piscean or 12th house matter too. Yeah. So good point. Whoa.
I think because we're getting time-wise. Is there some other points you want to make?
Well, there were some other factors that I was looking at, and they have to do with asteroids.
Okay.
One of them being, and this womb thing is a good segue from it, because one of it is the asteroid Persephone, who has also been called by some astrologers trans Pluto or Bacchus, who spent like about 80 years in in Leo during this time when the 19th Amendment was ratified, which is like, the inner child, sort of this kind of womb idea of giving birth to a child with equal rights, whether it's a man or a female. But yeah, and also one of the things I wanted to say was when that when the 19th Amendment was ratified, she was at Persephone was in the sign of Cancer, which is this another sign of the mother, of the birthing and stuff. And the thing about the myth of Persephone, that where she ends up spending half of the year in the underworld with Hades or Pluto, and half of the year with her mother, Demeter or Ceres. And there is something about that energy where, where women have to play this role of being seen and not seen, and how when it was in the sign of Leo and women were given the vote to become considered, more equal, even though the Equal Rights Amendment never got ratified, which is another piece of this. The Leo says, yes, she should be like the king. You should see her as just, an equal to. That's kind of part of that same energy. And I wanted to mention too, the Uranus Neptune cycle. We did mention that earlier on. So no, okay. I was thinking maybe I did not get to everything that I wanted to mention, but I did.
And it's interesting for this current generation. You talked about it back in 1821, but the most recent one, in the 1990s. This is really that generation of, that's when like that movie Ma Vie en Rose came out. When there was like, a lot of these children coming forward who were, they started calling it, I think, sexual dysphoria or something or gender dysphoria, where, children who were, born a certain sex were perceiving themselves as another sex, and some parents even, allowing, surgeries happen. So I think, this interesting, that interesting thing of, Uranus and Neptune together, you don't really know what you're going to get. And, Capricorn is like this, perfecting earth energy. So, what is it that, what kind of interesting range, what kind of creature, or what kind of expression, and I don't mean creature, in a derogatory meaning towards anyone, but meaning like what kind of conglomeration of beingness is going to be created in that. It's literally the soup of humanity, right?
Right. Well, a young person, a younger than me person, whom I know, when she was in college, she took a class on gender studies, and she said, what's the first thing that people ask when someone says they're pregnant? Oh, do you know what it is? What sex is it? They want to know that right away. And what difference does it make?
I usually say it's going to be a puppy, because that just kind of like throws people so off, they don't, because it's so funny, because we're, that's that male organizing energy, right? It's that Aquarian kind of thing. Like, what is it? I need to figure it out. Whereas that Piscean thing is like, oh my God, how wonderful what a beautiful active creation you've got going on in your belly right now.
Yes, let it be. Let it grow and come forth into the world, a magnificent human being. Michael, this has been such a joy to talk with you again.
It's always a pleasure talking to you. And how can people find you, Merrylin?
Well, you can email me at moonwise@ksfr.org, or Merrylin LeBlanc at gmail.com. Telephone 505-690-1878.
And if you like this video, please share it. Please like it. Please subscribe if you're not already subscribed. I'm Michael Bartlett. I'm in Santa Fe, New Mexico. I'm reachable at michael@coremichael.com or 690-3860. It's a pleasure being with you again, Merrylin, as we do our deep dives with new perspectives. Have a wonderful day, everyone.
Bye.